We are having some problems, but let me begin. And if you lose me, I'll be back in one form or another. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to thank our co-sponsors for joining forces with us today. UCLA Center for European and Russian Studies, Berkeley Center for International Relations, and Luskin Department of Public Policy. Our speaker today is Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, focusing on U.S. foreign policy. I usually have a chance to speak to our speaker beforehand, but because of the problems, I didn't have a chance. So welcome, Aaron, an old friend and an amazing person. He has written 5 books, including his most recent, The End of Greatness, Why America Can't Have and Doesn't Want Another Great President. And The Much Too Promised Land, America's Elusive Search for Arab-Israeli Peace. Between 1978 and 2003, Miller served at the State Department as a historian, analyst, negotiator, and advisor to Republican and Democratic secretaries of state, where he helped formulate U.S. policy on the Middle East and the Arab-Israeli peace process, most recently as the senior advisor for Arab-Israeli negotiations. He also served as the deputy special Middle East coordinator for Arab-Israeli negotiations. Amazing. Senior member of the State Department's policy planning staff, in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, and in the Office of the Historian. He has received the department's Distinguished Superior and Meritorious Honor Awards from 2006 to 2019. He was a public policy scholar, vice president for new initiatives, and director of the Middle East program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. He's also a global affairs analyst for CNN. I see him often. His articles have appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, Politico, Foreign Policy, USA Today, and CNN.com. He's a frequent commentator on NPR, BBC, and Sirius XM radio. So, ladies and gentlemen, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. You may not remember that anymore. I've mentioned so many things. Let me introduce you to Aaron David Miller. Aaron, it's all yours.
First of all, thanks to CMED and to you for hosting me. It's a pleasure and an honor. I don't get to see enough of you. I'll have to find a way to fix that. I want to make some observations generally about U.S. foreign policy in view of Ukraine, and then conclude with several observations about the Middle East. This will be, I hope, relatively short and painless. If I go on too long, more than 15 minutes or so, please let me know. I've been in Washington now for almost 40 years, following foreign policy, studying it, analyzing it, playing a small role in trying to help very important and busy decision makers shape it. 3 keys have more or less guided my analytical and prescriptive view over the course of the last four decades. One is geography, in my judgment, is destiny. I think it's probably the most important factor that informs and shapes a nation's foreign policy. And in the case of the American Republic, it's truly special. We're the only great power in the history of the world. There are no exceptions. Literally sandwiched between 2 non-predatory powers to our north and south, and literally to our east and west fish. What one historian, wish it had been me, described as our liquid assets. These liquid assets, these 2 oceans, and the stark reality that we are not threatened by our neighbors, I think more than anything else explains the way we behave abroad. I think it explains our naivete. There might have been a time when we were a nation of 4 million humans, 400,000 slaves, perched precariously along a narrow strip on the eastern seaboard with the great powers, the Brits, the Spanish, the French, literally in our backyard, that we felt like a small nation. But I think clearly by the late 19th, early 20th century, that was no longer the case. And I think we've lost any sense. Intellectually, I think we grasp it, but I don't think we grasp it emotionally, what it's like for the small power. And when I say the small power, I don't really mean a power that is necessarily small in size. I mean powers for whom geography and history play a major role in shaping the way they behave. We, the United States, to the degree that it is possible, have freed ourselves from these two forces. Most of the countries with whom we deal have not, whether it's China, Russia, Britain, Israel, Egypt, Iran, Saudi Arabia. These are nations which may never fully free themselves from these two forces. And in our case, it leads, I think, to a number of potentially bad decisions. It also explains, to a large degree, our idealism. We've never been occupied, except for a short period of time during the early portion of the 19th century, excuse me. We have not been figuratively pillaged as a nation. And I think this, in many respects, our separation from the rest of the world has created a sort of an idealistic view that all problems somehow, and that leads me to my next behavioral trait, are pragmatism. That somehow all problems have solutions, and a good many of those problems have American solutions. This obviously is a very fraught, if not dangerous, concept. But it is a function, I would argue, in part of our geographic location. Second, I guess I'm not a religious person, but I am a kind of devout follower of the Protestant theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, who argued that the best you can do, for many different reasons, are proximate solutions to insoluble problems. If you make the perfect the enemy of the good, you'll neither get the perfect nor the good. And I would argue to you that since there is no perfect justice this side of the other side, that this notion of proximate solutions to insoluble problems is a critical component, I think, of how I think things change. Too often, we declare our war on things: the war on poverty, the war on mental illness, the war on drugs, the war on racial prejudice, the war on terror, as if these wars will somehow have a definitive or comprehensive end and these problems will be resolved. They will not be resolved over time. All of them that I've mentioned are still quite affecting, and one or two hang dangerously over the fate of this nation. And finally, I think another important sort of North Star that has guided me is that the dividing line for an effective foreign policy is not between left and right, or between Republican or Democrat, or between Democrat, Republican, left or right, or conservative and liberal. It's between dumb on one hand and smart on the other. And the question you have to ask yourself when you talk about American domestic politics as an energizing force in American foreign policy is which side of the line do you want America to be on, the smart side or the dumb side? The smart side requires belief fundamentally in something called the American national interest. It teaches all of us, or should, humility and prudence in the way we respond. And above all, it teaches that you need to identify what your objectives are and ensure that you have the means at your disposal to try to achieve those objectives. So geography is destiny, proximate solutions to insoluble problems, and the national interests, in many respects, taking precedent over the narrow or overtly political interest. Shorthanded, how to turn the M in me upside down so it becomes a W in we. I would argue to you that that is, frankly, the greatest challenge that the nation faces, and it will affect, and in fact, if it's not corrected, the way we look at the rest of the world and the way we behave in it. So let me make 6 observations about the nature of our foreign policy in recent years, and then deal with a few regarding the Middle East. First, Gulliver's Troubles. This is a world not to be transformed. It's a world to be managed. It's a world of multipolar powers, large and small, many of whom challenge American influence and interests. I cannot point to, and maybe some of you can, a single problem beyond our shores that in all good conscience with a straight face, I could argue has a definitive or comprehensive solution. What to do about Ukraine, how to deal with China, what to do about Russia, with Putin or without, how to deal with Iran, what to do about the Arab-Israeli conflict, what to do about climate, how to cope with the next pandemic. These are problems that need to be managed because they are not, in my judgment, resolvable, certainly unilaterally by the United States. And transformations in American foreign policy and diplomacy are extremely rare. In fact, we'll be lucky if we can create what I would call successful transactions. Second, domestic challenges. If Joe Biden were on this call, he'd likely say that the way he envisioned his presidency was to redeem and try to transform America, not the world. The Constitution talks not about perfecting a more perfect world. It talks about perfecting a more perfect, working toward perfecting a more perfect union. And Ukraine, in this respect, I would argue, has become a very challenging distraction. The State of the Union speech that the president gave had 6,500 words in it. Only 82 of those 6,500 words were devoted to one of the greatest challenges that our nation faces right now, which is what to do about voting rights. We now suffer from a pernicious polarization. It goes well beyond differences and disagreements over policy. It's a pernicious polarization that has become personal and tribal on everything from guns to immigration to voting rights to abortion. And it is rapidly overloading a domestic political system that no longer is as adept as it has been, imperfectly to be sure, in coping and managing solutions to these problems. Just one statistic about pernicious polarization. In 1960, when asked, would you mind if your daughter or son married a member of the opposite political party, 6% of Americans polled yes. Now, 45% of Democrats and 35% of Republicans would be opposed to their kids marrying outside of, forget their faith, marrying outside of their political party. And we now, unfortunately, for this administration, are distracted and challenged, not just by political dysfunction at home, but by a set of very difficult challenges abroad. Third, risk aversion. If you looked at the first year of Joe Biden's foreign policy, you would conclude, despite all of the lofty rhetoric of the campaign, that it would be a fairly risk-averse policy with respect to how it actually behaved. Afghanistan, with the decision to withdraw, badly managed, to be sure, was the riskiest decision that Joe Biden made in the first year of his presidency, at least until Ukraine. It was a pretty color between the lines policy designed to shore up alliances, inject some values back into a foreign policy that its predecessor had more or less emptied them from, clean up a lot of the difficulties and messes that his predecessor had made, reversing the Muslim ban, rejoining the Paris Climate, rejoining the WHO. None of it showed a lot of great ambition or terrible risk readiness of an administration that sought to or believed that the battle for the 21st century was between democracies and dictators. That was all about to change, which brings me to my fourth point. Life in diplomacy, life in general, is very contingent. It depends on unpredictabilities and uncertainties that none of us can control, or over which we have little control. Harold Macmillan, the former British Prime Minister, when asked what could change British policy, simply replied, as only a British Prime Minister might have, "Dear boy, events. Events." We need humility in this analysis, but Ukraine happened to be a potentially transformative event. which in a way gave life to the two sorts of tropes that the president had articulated during the campaign. One is America was back and it would lead again, back at the head of the table, to use his exact words. And second, as I mentioned earlier, the 21st century was going to be a struggle between authoritarians and Democrats, between Democrats and dictators for the control of the 21st century. And the object of Biden's point, if you look at the talking points and the speeches he gave, was obviously China. But Ukraine reframed and gave energy to both of those propositions. It also steadied the sort of notion that had grown up in the wake of Afghanistan that America was done leading. Afghanistan was so badly handled, such a delight to our adversaries and such a challenge to our allies and our partners, that there were questions raised about whether America actually was back and for how long. But I think the Biden administration, and I would argue life isn't perfect, but this was the best example of alliance management, certainly since Bush 41 and James A. Baker, for whom I worked, with respect to pushing Saddam out of Kuwait, launching an Operation Tin Cup to pay for that war, and to creating some semblance of order in the wake of that war, certainly with respect to the Arab-Israeli issue with the Madrid Peace Conference. Biden stood up, and you know what they say, a leader without followers is just somebody out for a walk. Biden stepped up, inspired, but Europe also, I think, came out of its own cocoon with respect to the threats on its own continent. NATO is a combination of 30 countries, only 2 of which are actually on the not on the continent, the United States and Canada. Europe was now threatened. The Germans, despite some of their backsliding recently, performed in a way no one ever believed they would. NATO had been given new relevance. The EU, as demonstrated by the oil ban, imperfect though it is as an instrument of diplomacy, has remained united more than 100 days into this conflict. And Russia has underperformed, to say the least. The Russian military, as a consequence of huge failings in logistic, morale, insufficient coordination between air and ground operations, all tethered to one fundamental strategic miscalculation, that Russia would be able to pacify a country. And let's not forget, Ukraine is the second largest country in Europe, pacifying a country of 40 million plus people with insufficient forces. But as we've seen in recent weeks, the Russians are adjusting. American policy on sanctions and on serving as a sort of arsenal of democracy, that theme has been invoked, World War II theme, as has Lend-Lease in legislation, has defined the limits of what it is prepared to do. The administration made clear earlier on that it was not interested in a direct confrontation with Russia. It would not create a no-fly zone, would not create a humanitarian zone that would be policed by American forces. It would give Ukraine what it needed to brunt the force of this aggression, of this invasion, but no more. We live with the uncertainty of the use of deployment of chemical weapons, the deployment of a tactical nuclear weapon, either there's a test or on the battlefield. Most experts seem to think that's unlikely, but we're not done. It's early days, which brings me to another point, number 5, on how is this going to end? I think it's impossible right now to say. If Pythia, the Oracle of Delphi, were on this call, she probably wouldn't have a clue, reading the best of goat entrails and coffee grinds. My sense is that it probably won't end. If you buy the argument, as some of those who follow Russia closely do, that Ukraine was not some de novo event, it was a continuation of a strategy which Vladimir Putin has launched as early, and he telegraphed this at the Munich Security Conference in 2007, that Russia was humiliated, that the West didn't appreciate its security guarantees. And then he undertook a series of action in 2008 in Ukraine and Transnistria, 2014 in Crimea. The Russian experts I talked to, some of them, believe that 2022 was merely an extension, and that while the initial phase of the Russian invasion has been checked and constrained, the Russians are not done. It was 8 years since 2014, we had Ukraine. The notion that this could drag on for months, people object to the term frozen. It's not a frozen conflict. It may heat up and down. It may have a dynamic. It seems to me right now, since I see no opportunity through diplomacy, or certainly through victory, neither side can afford to win. Neither side can afford to lose, and neither side right now is in a position to win. I see no way that this is going to end anytime soon. Let me make one additional point before I move on to the Middle East, and that is on the issue of individuals and their importance in history. Carlyle argued, and some push back against this, and I can understand why, that history is the biography of great men. I would add, and women as well. But I think what Ukraine has done is to remind all of us of the importance of humans in the historical narrative. Marx, not Groucho Marx, Karl Marx said that, again, men, he's writing in the 19th century, men make history, but rarely as they please. So Marx understood the power of contingency to constrain human action. But all you have to do is consider, when was the last time any human on this planet kept the world on the edge of its collective seat for days, speculating, would he or would he not invade Ukraine? When was the last time any world leader took this sort of action? And when was the last time a Churchillian figure in the person of Volodymyr Zelensky emerged to inspire and to lead? It reminds me of John Keegan's notion, the former late British historian, that 6 men in Keegan's mind shaped the history of much of the 20th century. 6 human beings were responsible for most of the death, destruction, and prospects of peace, security, and prosperity. Lenin, Mao, Hitler, Stalin, Churchill, and FDR. It reminds us, despite all the contingencies, of the importance of humans and leaders in affecting change and introducing events both for good or not so good. A few comments to conclude on the Middle East. At the outset of this administration, with the exception of Iran, I would argue, I had Brett McGurk on a show I run at Carnegie called Carnegie Connects several months ago, who made a very compelling case that the Middle East was not being deprioritized. I think Brett did a great job, but I think it has been deprioritized. The United States is not withdrawing from the Middle East. There's no question about that. But a number of other factors over the course of the last 2 decades has clearly set it in greater perspective and diminished its priority. 1 is a rising China. 2 is our own domestic dysfunction. 3 is the very unhappy experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan, where the standard for victory for the United States was never could we win, but when could we leave? And perhaps something even more fundamental. All or most of all of the problems in this region are beyond the capacity of the United States to repair, either alone, to be sure, or even in a multilateral framework. We now see 4 or 5 Arab states in active phases of dysfunction. Yemen, despite the encouraging renewal now twice of a ceasefire, Libya, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq. The Middle East is a place, with some exceptions, where American ideas go to die. And the Arab world is in a profound state of dysfunction. There was a time when 3 Arab states competed for influence and power: Egypt, Iraq, and Syria. to use my framing, all three of them in many respects have much more diminished influence. In the case of Syria, and I would argue Iraq, they're really offline. That's produced and presented an opportunity for key Gulf states to emerge, particularly Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. The Emiratis with a far more wise, sober, and effective policy than the Saudis. More on that, hopefully during the Q&A. I would keep my eye on, as I have, and I've been making this point for years now, with the three non-Arabs. The three non-Arabs are states to watch: Israel, Iran, and Turkey. All are stable domestically, all have tremendous economic potential, all have military and security services that are quite capable, and all have the capacity to project their power abroad. One is America's closest ally in the Middle East, another is a member of NATO, and a third at the moment is an outlier. But these three states are serious countries. And again, they have the capacity to do both good and not so good in a very complicated region. Ukraine has generated a certain degree of urgency on part of the administration. I don't know if you saw the report today. OPEC Plus seems to have agreed to increase the monthly production from 400,000 barrels a day to 600,000. I think it's an indication maybe of what's to come with respect to Saudi Arabia. So Ukraine has energized American policy, but with the exception of Iran, in my view, the only issue that could generally spark a regional war to draw America in and result in higher oil prices and plunging stock markets around the world. With the exception of Iran, the administration is simply not willing or able, in my judgment, to spend an inordinate amount of time on most any of the issues in the region. Governing is about choosing, and I think it's about setting priorities. FDR once quipped about Lincoln that Lincoln died a sad man because he did not have everything. And Lincoln was our most, clearly our undeniably greatest president. Governing is about choosing. And the Republic now confronts some serious choices at home, which will impact for sure on foreign policy. I won't go beyond 2022 midterms, which is, if history is a guide, every incumbent's party since 1946 during the first midterm has lost an average of 25, 26 seats. That's clearly going to happen here. I'm not going to speculate about the general election, but I will only conclude by saying this, that our adversaries are counting on additional dysfunction, and our allies are worried and asking themselves the question, yes, America is back, but for how long?
Well, what a presentation. It's the best I've heard about the current American situation. And let me ask the first question. We were trying to deal with the Middle East and where it stands in America. I thought you did it perfectly, but I have one question. You had one exception, Iran, but Iran could well change everything, be the Russia of the Middle East. How are we going to prevent that?
Well, prevent. I mean, let's be clear. The relationship with Iran and the United States is a transactional relationship. It's about giving and taking. It's not about transforming relations between the Islamic Republic of Iran and the United States of America. The JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, was an effort to preempt an Israeli strike and to make an American strike unnecessary. That logic still applies. And as Joe Biden is fond of saying, don't compare me to the Almighty, he says, compare me to the alternative. I would argue, and some have argued with me, and there's legitimate debate to be had on this, is what is worse? Allowing the Iranians to access billions of dollars in frozen reserves and monies that they're going to make as a consequence of Iranian oil coming back online to feed their regional aspirations, or no agreement, which over time will lead to additional progress on the nuclear issue. Certainly enough fissile material to make a bomb, one bomb. Some believe that they already have enough to make 3 raw explosive devices with the highly enriched uranium that they have. Most military experts seem to think it's a year or 2 to miniaturize a warhead, to create a delivery system that could actually project a nuclear weapon over some distance. My view is whatever the imperfections of the deal, and there are many, that it's better to constrain Iran's nuclear capacity, but it is at best a way to buy time. And I have not heard any explanation from anybody to what are you buying time for? Iran is a nation, I identified one of the 3 most consequential in the region. These are keeper nations. They're not going to be destroyed. They're not going to be fundamentally altered in terms of how they look at the region. Iran is driven by a profound sense of insecurity and entitlement. And that's a very dangerous combination. They're going to want to either be a nuclear weapons threshold state, or should they choose to cross the line, as the North Koreans have done, a nuclear weapons state. And that means a guaranteed and very fraught situation, because the Israelis will strike. You could argue that it'll be like mowing the grass, that it won't eliminate Iran's capacity. The Americans could strike. I mean, 4 US presidents have committed themselves. So I don't think, Steve, that given the realities in Washington, the Biden administration is prepared to do what Iran wants it to do on the single discrete issue of what to do about the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is to delist it. Everybody agrees that's symbolic, it's meaningless, but Biden is concluding he's not going to do it. I mean, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is under 24/7 protection as a consequence of IRGC threats against his life. Can you imagine if Biden delisted the IRGC, what the political reaction would be? However, they'll remain sanctioned under any number of statutes, but he's not going down that road. And that's what the Iranians seem to want. And maybe they'll figure out a way to find some other issue that the administration is prepared to compromise in. But it's been 15, 18 months already. So I think that the prospects of a deal are well under 50%. Some people think it's worse odds than that. So yeah, we're in for a rough ride.
In your argument, without a deal, the situation is just going to get worse and we can't get a deal. Is there any other way to do it, given the strength of your position, that this is better than the alternative?
Well, you could hope and then set into motion a number of policies that would seek to reinforce Iran's own caution with respect to ramping up the nuclear program to a point where the Israelis or the Americans would feel compelled to strike. You could try to create more of a strategic alignment. I've heard talk of regional defense organizations in the Gulf. And probably that's those security guarantees and focus on defensive systems is coming to a neighborhood theater near you pretty soon, I would expect. It's one of the ways that the administration believes it can, to some degree, constrain Iran. You could make an American policy on what the consequences of Iran's crossing that threshold would be much clearer. You could do that. But I think if the Iranians want to cross the threshold and actually weaponize, they will try to do it. And it's going to be messy, very messy. But I don't have any plan Bs.
All right, I understand. Let's go to our questions from various people around the world. The first person is Marina Ingman from the UCLA alum. Is UK's influence on the Middle East as strong as the American?
British influence, UK?
That's what she asked.
I mean, I think the withdrawal from the Brexit has clearly diminished Britain's impact on its European partners and allies. Britain remains a key American ally in terms of intelligence sharing and other cooperative efforts. The Brits made their mark in the Middle East decades ago, and they either were happy or not so happy to get rid of it. They may well be better off as a consequence. So I think, again, I don't see Britain as a seminal force in shaping what happens in that region.
Okay, let's go to Murhaf Yujani of the U.S. Naval Academy. Murhaf has had a whole range of experiences. And with regard to the Arab-Israeli conflict, we need conflict resolution, not conflict management, he says. What are your thoughts?
My thoughts are, yeah, he's right. Murph's right. But you have three missing ingredients. And until you have them in place, or even two of the three, you're going to manage. Number one, you need leaders on both sides who are not prisoners of their ideologies and their domestic politics, but relative masters of them. You do not have that. You need a sense of ownership on the part of Israelis and Palestinians that some negotiation leading to a durable outcome is in their interests, and they're willing to protect those that interest and don't need to be told by outside parties that this is important, and you don't have that sense of ownership. I would remind you that almost without exception, every breakthrough in this region on the Arab-Israeli issue, Israel-Jordan, Israel-Palestine, Israel-Egypt, came without the participation of the United States. And that tells you something about ownership. It really does. And finally, you need effective mediation by a third party or some party. It's not the United States, whose track record on this issue is mixed. You need a mediator who is prepared to apply both honey and vinegar in sufficient amounts once the parties demonstrate some sort of capacity. The role of the international community, I'm sorry to say, on so many issues is fundamentally weak on this. Look at COVID as an example. Look at Syria as another example of what the international community, excuse me, has failed to do. There's not a single nation who sits in the UN, 193, 195 countries, that is prepared to make the redemption of Palestine a core, central, or even important national interest. And that is why you've seen a remarkable, people don't want to talk about it, they don't want to admit it, We were told, and I'm just reporting here, please, so don't shoot me. We were told that unless the Israelis settled up, that Israel will become a pariah nation, that Europe, Asia, Latin America, Africa, the Arabs would continue to pressure the Israelis. The reality is the exact opposite has happened. Israel enjoys more support now in the world with their settlement policy, with their lack of a commitment to any solution that would remotely satisfy Palestinian concerns. The Israelis have representation, meaningful representation, in more countries now than at any point since independence. And in the ultimate betrayal, you could argue, of the Palestinian cause, the Arabs now have essentially made a judgment. The Emiratis, the Bahrainis, the Moroccans, Sudan is a member of the Arab League. Its situation is a little more fraught as a consequence of its own internal politics. And now people are talking about the prospects of meaningful steps between Israel and Saudi Arabia. So the international community is not going to redeem Palestine. And neither will the United States. Governing is about choosing. It's about setting priorities. And an American president right now facing almost certain defeat of his party in the midterms. Mass shootings, an inflation rate not seen since the 80s, a revanchist Russia, a rising China, and Iran that seems bent on ramping up its nuclear production is not going to spend a lot of capital and currency on an issue, frankly, that is not ready for prime time. You do not have an Israeli leader or a Palestinian leader, for that matter, that has the moral authority and the legitimacy and the will, let alone the skill, to bring their respective communities along, to even start a negotiation on the least bad outcome to this conflict, which is separation into two states. So I'm sorry, I wish it weren't so, but it is so.
All right, let's go to a somewhat similar question from Abdullah Ahmed, U.S. With the U.S. stepping away from the Middle East, do you believe the Abraham Accords will strengthen or die without a world power behind it?
One of the virtues of these agreements, and I remember meeting with Jared Kushner in 2016, he kindly decided to solicit my advice, although I'm not sure he listened to a word of it. These agreements, the Trump administration deserves a lot of credit for pulling them together, but they were based largely on a set of changing regional realities that offered up an opportunity which the Trump administration, I think to some degree to a fault, because they ignored the other half of the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Palestinian issue, was willing to take on. And that was this. Arab states were growing increasingly concerned about a rising Iran and the impact of Sunni jihad in ISIS and all kinds of Al-Qaeda derivatives on one hand. They were frustrated and exhausted with the dysfunctional Palestinian movement, which right now, literally between Hamas and Fatah, looks like Noah's Ark. There's two of everything, two sets of security services, two governments, two constitutions, two sets of patrons, two different visions about where Palestine is and what it's supposed to be. Frustrated with the Palestinians, worried about Iran, and eager to borrow a page from Sadat's book that if you want to get to Washington, the road lies through Jerusalem. Those three factors sort of came together to create these under the table contexts between the Emiratis and the Israelis and the Bahrainis. And there's a lot more going on under the table between Israel and Saudi Arabia. When MBS finally sits down with an Israeli prime minister, And it may happen. I don't think it'll happen anytime soon. It will not be the first time that he's met with an Israeli prime minister. But all this came together as an outgrowth of certain regional realities, which had nothing to do with the United States. Then the Trump administration, in its transactional way, offered all kinds of goodies in exchange. And key Arab states were only too willing to take them. So the answer to the question is yes. I think, particularly in the case of Israel and the Emirates, this is a relationship that is homegrown and is going to endure.
Mohammed Akbar of Saudi Arabia, continuing what you just were talking about, what is the future of the United States relationship with Saudi Arabia?
I'm not an objective.
Will there be, pardon?
Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, sure. Will there be a relationship as long as MBS is in power behind the scenes?
I'm not an objective observer on this. I've written extensively and spoken extensively. Jamal Khashoggi was a friend of mine. He was a friend of so many. But I think that the United States this administration has made a decision, energized by Ukraine, to effect some kind of, call it what you want, détente, rapprochement, kiss and make up, I don't know what you want to call it, with the Saudis. And more than likely, President Biden will travel. He will meet Mohammed bin Salman. He will have a meeting with the GCC, probably plus the Egyptians and the Iraqis, probably after he visits Israel. Out of that meeting, I suspect the Saudis will be inclined to increase oil production, as they've already seemed to do today in view of today's announcement with the OPEC Plus meeting. There may be some modest steps with the Israelis, and probably a serious set of discussions between the US and Saudi Arabia on security. But I will say this. The dynamic that has powered the US-Saudi relationship for decades. The first book I wrote was called Search for Security, Saudi Arabian Oil and American Foreign Policy. Began with a lengthy description of FDR's meeting with Abdulaziz in the Great Bitter Lake. Was driven by an oil for security dynamic. That's been under enormous stress in recent years. We are a competitor to Saudi Arabia in the oil market right now. We don't need their oil. The rest of the world does, but we don't need it. And with America's decision to reprioritize and shift the focus now to Europe with Ukraine and to Northeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific with respect to China, we're reluctant to enter into far-reaching security guarantees with the Saudis. So the oil for security alignment has grown increasingly fraught. I think, frankly, unless Mohammed bin Salman demonstrates that he is prudent and sober and understands the way politics work, I think it's going to be extremely difficult. He has reformed Saudi Arabia to a degree that I never thought possible, but the price has been a degree of authoritarian repression and brutality that is really quite stunning. Just read the beginning of the State Department Human Rights Report for 2021 on Saudi Arabia. Sounds like something out of Edgar Allan Poe. So yes, there's going to be a unfreezing of the freeze. How far it goes depends on many other things.
Changing the subject a little bit temporarily, Mary Langley of the US asks, do you see the image of the United States ever coming back from the Trump years? It seems that there's no way back.
That's an interesting question.
Yeah, it is.
I think that in terms of American leadership abroad, to a large degree, the Biden administration has, in fact, done a lot to repair the doubts and uncertainties that our allies and partners had during the Trump years. But as I concluded my talk with all of you, America is back. This is rather deft alliance management, what we've seen over the last 100 days or so. But for how long is America back? I will say this, that we live in a glass house now. We have to be very careful what we preach to the rest of the world, given our own democratic backsliding and our own dysfunction. And it is severe. And I think it's likely to get worse, because I don't see the current political system, which is managed throughout 200 and almost 50 years to accommodate division and polarization. It broke down, as you know, in 1861. We had a civil war that claimed the lives of almost 1 million Americans. But the system regained its recuperative powers. It produced some extraordinary changes for the good, socially and economically. The New Deal, civil rights, Social Security. In many respects, America is becoming a more inclusive society. Look at the Supreme Court, however conservative it may be. It now contains members that would have stunned Louis Brandeis when he was faced confirmation in 1916 as the first Jewish Supreme Court justice. But I worry the system will not be able to accommodate the stresses that we now face. I voted for Republicans and Democrats. I work for Republicans and Democrats. I do not recognize, yes, the Democrats have dysfunction. Their messaging is all wrong. I think they've unnecessarily constrained and tied down the progressive wing of the party. But there's no symmetry here. One party in a two-party system has no respect for norms and institutions, and worse than that, enable the worst kind of conspiracy theories and ideology that is undermining the very nature of consensus and compromise in the United States. I don't see how we continue to improve and perfect this union, as the Constitution obliges us to do, with that kind of situation. And I don't see it getting better, because I don't understand how it gets better. We are now two nations, effectively.
Just to explain to everyone and to our speaker, what I'm trying to do is I collect questions, is ask questions not necessarily in the order they come, but in terms of being similar, so that we don't go way back and forth. And there are so many topics that are being raised. So our next question is from Steve Zipperstein, who many of you know, a close friend of ours, and a lecturer and everything at UCLA, and so popular. And the question is, who is truly running U.S. foreign policy today? Biden, Jake Sullivan, Antony Blinken, Ron Klain, all or none of the above? It's a question that doesn't usually get asked on TV. I wouldn't want to be asked it. Good luck.
Who's running American foreign policy? Look, I would argue that question would have been, again, and I'll remind all of you, I voted for Republicans and Democrats, and I've worked for them too. That question would have been much more germane, I think, if asked of the previous administration. I think the Biden administration has created a certain measure of order. They've restored, I think, their commitment to public service and to structure. The State Department is clearly less hollowed out under Tony Blinken's leadership than it was under either Rex Tillerson's or Mike Pompeo, who in my judgment may well go down as the worst Secretary of State in American history. I worked for 6 I'm not an authority, but I have a point of view on this matter. The NSC is run by an extremely deft, and I would even argue brilliant individual, Jake Sullivan, experienced a foreign policy president as one could imagine. My friend of 40 years, Bill Burns, is now director of the CIA, which is the first time that a Foreign Service officer rising up from the ranks is put in charge of the agency. Bill was a consumer of the product, which is phenomenal because he understands how to brief and what is important for principals to hear. And he's a person of great integrity and honesty. I don't think the problem lies, I mean, there are times, frankly, having worked for James Baker and having interviewed Henry Kissinger, there are times when I somehow hope that there would be a Kissinger or Baker-like figure, particularly with respect to Ukraine. But I think the problem the administration faces is very little to do with structure or the absence of talent. As I pointed out in my initial comment, this is not a world to be transformed. It's a world to be managed. And if you're lucky, to protect American interests during the process of management. The notion of heroic diplomacy, Jimmy Carter at Camp David, Henry Kissinger going to China, Dick Holbrooke at Dayton. I mean, these are successes that are few and far between. They require people who know how to negotiate on one side with opportunities that would make a successful negotiation possible. So I don't think the flaws or the faults lie in the administration. Steve Zipperstein might argue that, and in a way he'd be right, that we don't have one Secretary of State. Arguably, you could say we have three. You have Tony Blinken, you have Bill Burns, who could have been Secretary of State. You have Jake Sullivan, who could have been Secretary of State. But I think they've harmonized their relationship. This is not Bill Rogers and Henry Kissinger in the early 70s, Secretary of State and Henry Kissinger as NSC advisor. And nor is this the Reagan years, in which the president went through how many? 7 national security advisors? There's very little of that. So I think the president is the president, Steve. Secretary of State, who's known the president for decades, is the Secretary of State, and National Security Advisor does what national security advisors do. Afghanistan worried me, I must say. But again, I'll fall back on Ukraine, which I think was redemptive for the administration. Because the one critique that people sometimes level is that there's a lack of operational capacity, which is an interesting point. But I think Ukraine has more or less removed that. And I forgot the Defense Department, of course.
I see a book emerging here. All right, our next question is very different. And
no more books, but go ahead.
Pardon?
No more books, but go ahead. Go ahead.
More books, article, speeches. Any rate, Bowden Oppenheim of Santa Monica says, what's your prediction on the fate of Putin as a person, not country, and who might be next, and how should we react to it? I don't know. Many people, if any, can answer that worldwide, but good luck.
I mean, again, it would be foolish to predict. Historians of Russia will tell you that after every military defeat, there has been either a revolution or a cause for serious reform, which wouldn't augur well for Putin. But again, we're still in early days in Ukraine. An internal challenge, I'm told by every Russian expert that I know or have read, is simply not going to happen. the Sloviki, the intelligence and security elites that surround the president, all of whom are roughly his age, all of whom are products of a former Soviet Union that they feel now aggrieved and humiliated. The challenge might come from them, but the Russian experts say, no, it won't. Whatever public protests there are in Russia, and whatever information is getting through, that is non-Russian television, which dominates the views of the pensioners. Levada, which is a credible source of polling, still finds majority support for Russia's Ukraine adventure. Reading yet another report that Putin has advanced cancer. This one says he's dying. I think that you're going to, barring some, again, obviously unforeseen set of circumstances, you're going to be dealing with Vladimir Putin for a good long while.
All right, we're going to move from that depressive conclusion to a series of questions on the Middle East. Miriam Ben Ahmed of Syria asks, with the new administration after Trump, what will U.S. involvement in Syria look like? Will Biden follow in Trump's footsteps? And what does this mean for the greater Levant region?
As I mentioned, I think that the United States is deprioritizing this region as not withdrawing from it. There's a very important distinction, not withdrawing from it, but deprioritizing. Certainly at the level of president, or even at the level of the Secretary of State. The preoccupation with Ukraine now and with Russia and with China is going to absorb their attention well through the midterms. And once the midterms are over, you're now into presidential election time. On Syria, I think the administration will want to do more on the humanitarian side, but I think it's going to be very difficult to juggle its non-relationship with the Assad regime on one hand, its willingness to acquiesce in Israeli policy against Iranian influence in Syria, and Turkey, that is now back in the kind of friends category because of Ukraine. There's talk now of selling the Turks the F-16s because they're now out of the F-35 program because they bought the S-400 system from the Russians. And Turkey is now talking about mounting a significant military operation into northern Syria against the Kurds. I think that the policy contours will be trying to relieve as much humanitarian pressure as possible and trying to keep the UN corridor open, the only one that is now open. But the future of Syria, I'm afraid, lies in the hands, and sadly to say, not of the Syrian people, but of the Assad regime and Iran. It's be interesting to see, depending on how Ukraine goes and how Russia goes, whether Russian policy in Syria will be altered as a consequence of Ukraine. I don't think so. So I think the future of Syria is going to be fraught on most all levels. The Assad regime may control most of the country, but not all of it. The humanitarian problem will remain intense. You're going to see any number of ISIS and Al-Qaeda derivatives continue to function. I see no comprehensive solution that would be good or even better right now for the Syrian people.
So let me say this, that two things. I hope I get everybody's name right. I apologize if I don't pronounce them correctly. They're people from all over. And secondly, we have only 2 questions left. So if some people by this time think it's hopeless, if you want to get in, you have a chance. So I get to ask questions instead. Anyway, Gopi Krishna, doctoral student at Virginia Tech in Arlington, Virginia, considering the hold of the Israeli lobby on the bipartisan U.S. politics, will the U.S. be able to play an honest broker role between Israel and the Palestinians?
I mean, the answer is that when the United States looks at the conflict and becomes a lawyer for both sides, there's a chance of an effective outcome. The three Americans who did more to broker agreements between Israel and the states and polities with which it shares contiguous borders, Kissinger, Carter, and Baker, all wrestled with the pro-Israeli community and, yes, the lobby in the United States, and essentially won. You know, it's my view that the American national interest, when it's clearly defined and when there are opportunities, trumps domestic politics in almost every occasion. That includes arms sales to the Arabs, none of which have ever been defeated. And it includes blocking assistance to Israel when, in fact, an administration, I worked for James Baker and George H.W. Bush decided back in the late 80s, early 90s, that Shamir's settlement policy was undercutting American interests, and they denied the Israelis $10 billion of housing loan guarantees. And Congress acquiesced in the rather deft diplomacy of Mr. Baker to pull that off. There are those who believe that the Israeli lobby owns Congress and the administration. And the historical record, in my judgment, certainly the time I was in government, that was not the case at all. I remember appearing at an AIPAC event in just shortly before the JCPOA was signed with Bret Stephens, who was arguing that there was no way the Obama administration would be able to survive the political pressures on the JCPOA. And I said that, with all due respect, you're wrong on this. A willful American president, a willful and skillful American president with a clear definition of the national interest can trump domestic politics. Now, that was then. It may well be that the pernicious polarization, what's happened to the political system, has made things go sideways. But I still believe deeply in the notion that there is something called the American national interest. It's shaped by many different forces and factors, but ultimately the president has to define what it is. And if it's critical, to expend political capital and currency in order to realize it.
So now we have a UCLA alum asking a very interesting question from Eric Selkov. Do you think Jenin terrorists that continue to murder Israeli civilians that not even the PA can control will cause a civil war in the West Bank? Do you think that having a Palestinian party as part of the Israeli government will have a lasting effect on the Palestinians and Israelis' relationship going forward? I guess that's two questions.
An interesting question. Mansour Abbas's, it is striking that within literally days of the worst violence between Israeli Arabs and Jews, which broke out in a half a dozen cities last May in the wake of the Israeli or during the Israeli-Hamas confrontation, within days of that, or within weeks, you had for the first time in the history of Israeli politics, a party representing Palestinian citizens of Israel, Israeli Arabs, Arabs, Israelis, however want to define themselves, that sits with parties to the right and center. And the triumph of their determination to play a role within the power structure in order to deliver for their communities. Now, how long the Bennett government will last is another matter. June 13th, which is next week, I believe, is the first year anniversary. And it's already teetering. So I think that's a good sign. And a fair amount of shekels have been obligated and assigned to address some of the chronic and compelling needs of the Palestinian community within Israel. As to Jenin, Jenin has become a problem. It also showed remarkable progress in the last decade or so in terms of a vibrant economy. The Arab American University is in Jenin, but 3 of the last half dozen or so terror attacks in Israel proper came out of Jenin, and the Israelis obviously have been conducting operations since then in the Jenin area. That's where we saw the tragic death of Abu Akla, Shireen Abu Akla. I think the Israelis now are debating basically what to do about Jenin and how to go about it. Because a major incursion, which is being talked about, into a hotbed of Palestinian nationalism and activities by Islamic Jihad, which is the predominant group in the Jenin area. Al-Aqsa brigades are there as well. Could be a trigger that set things ablaze. So I think that situation is very fraught and unpredictable.
And this question is different. Mana al-Sheikh from Egypt, with the recent arms deals between Egypt and the US, 3 deals so far since 2022, where do you see?
Between Egypt and
the US, that's why I said 2021, because I don't think there have been 3 in 2022, but I may be wrong.
Between Egypt and the US.
Egypt and US.
I think the US-Egyptian partnership is still viable, but I think for many different reasons, it's become less of a priority. Largely because others have grabbed center stage from what used to be a situation in which the Egyptians were primus inter pares. Is that it? First among equals. The Egyptians, as the largest and most powerful Arab state, in my judgment, is still extremely critical, not just because of the canal and their position in Africa, but because of the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty. And you now see regarding the issue of Saudi-Israeli reconciliation, an imminent American brokered deal that will somehow gain Israeli acquiescence over the 2 islands of Tiran and Sanafer and transfer them to full Saudi control. But I think human rights, particularly in Congress, has provided a major obstacle, as has President Sisi's crackdown on dissent. So I think in many respects, we must have a functional working relationship with Egypt, but it is taking a back seat of late to other priorities, even other priorities in the Middle East. The argument in Washington is that Egypt is diversifying its own weapons shipments. The question is, what kind of weapons do the Egyptians really need? Insurgency in Sinai, fighting Al-Qaeda derivatives, and jihadi groups there require a different kind of military relationship. Egyptians have been very reluctant to embrace that and are much more interested in prestige weapons. So I think the U.S.-Egyptian relationship is going through a transitional period, keeping in mind that we're going to have to maintain close ties because of our assistance program. It's because of the Egyptian-Israeli relationship.
Here's another question from Eric Selkoff of UCLA alum. With the Lebanon government and the economy in shambles, what do you predict for the future of Lebanon?
That's another one for the Oracle at Delphi. I mean, Lebanon's been in a state of chronic dysfunction for decades. And Lebanon suffers in large part from where it is, sandwiched between Israel, Syria, and the Mediterranean, and what it is. Its political system has been corrupted. And you don't have the kind of, what you have is extractive leadership that are either much more interested in their own personal gain or the interests of their community rather than Lebanon as a whole. The recent elections, according to some, seem to suggest that there are more independents and things may change, but it's hard for me to see how that happens. The economic situation is so bad, the institutions of the state so suspect, and the function of government so undermined that it no longer appears capable of delivering on just about anything, from garbage collection to electricity. And I don't see the kind of leadership willing and able to emerge and to cooperate. Hezbollah remains, even though their majority in the parliament has been reduced, Hezbollah remains the most important political military force in the country. And that's going to further erode the chances of a genuine national consensus emerging. I don't see much. Well, the elections, we should be hopeful, but I just don't see how that translates into making Lebanon a functioning, governing polity.
So we have the last question from the audience, and then I'll try to wrap this up because we've run out of time. And this is again from Steve Zipperstein. What do you think of the NBC News report from earlier this week that Biden is frustrated about his staff constantly clarifying his comments about Putin, Taiwan, etc.?
I mean, sure, he's frustrated. And that may well have been why the op-ed that appeared in the New York Times yesterday was written. It will become the sort of Bible by which to navigate or interpret what the administration is doing in Ukraine. There was no mention of war crimes there. There was no mention of weakening Putin personally, and there was no mention of regime change. It was an effort, I think, to get everybody, including the president, perhaps, on the same page. Presidential gaffes sometimes are not gaffes. Sometimes they're literally, well, I suppose that's what a gaffe is. They're literally expressions of how a president actually feels, but might have been more politic in expressing those views quietly or privately. And Biden's an emotional guy. And sometimes that emotion bubbles out, which is, I think, what happened in a couple of these cases. It's hard, given the moral clarity of Ukraine, the savagery and the brutality of what the Russians are doing to ordinary humans in Ukraine, try to keep a steady hand and head here to avoid an escalation that could create a set of circumstances worse than what we're witnessing now. But presidents, even without the deployment of American forces, need to constantly remind the American public why we're involved overseas and why we're doing what we're doing. And the president is going to have to do a lot more of that. And it seems to me to be effective. All of the principals who deal with foreign policy in his administration are going to have to be on the same message with him.
Thank you, Aaron. It seems we lost Steve, so I'm going to step in. And thank you so much for joining us on our webinar today. On behalf of all of us, again, thank you for the marvelous presentation and willingness to answer so many varied questions. I'd also like to thank our team for creating this opportunity for us to talk today. Salome Mohajer, Summer Smismi, Emily Pistoli, and Rita Dahi. If you are interested in past and future CMED events, please see your screen or chat window for more information. Bye for now, and thank you everyone for joining us. Goodbye.